All right, folks. So we're going to go ahead and continue the conversation that I started in a post yesterday. And the framing of this was talking about a specific instance that I've experienced in customer success. And one of the challenges that we have right now in the industry is that there's this standardization problem, right? Where there's an accepted set of like books and YouTube channels and guides that talk through how to set up a customer success team, how to set up a customer success process. And they give you a template, a blueprint, kind of a copy paste. There you go, successful customer success. And the challenge we have is that it doesn't work. Sometimes it does, of course. It's the standard practice. For some companies, it works great if they're exactly the model that it was written to cover. But the thing is that in a lot of cases, it's not enough. Either the team itself isn't structured correctly, there's something missing, or there's something wrong with the template that doesn't apply to this specific company or business model. And that's where we get to the issue where you have customer success that's not successful. And one of the challenges we have right now is not only that we have this kind of standard accepted template, but that there's very little discussion about what that template should be and changing it. We've settled into this kind of established workflow, and that's what everyone assumes is the approach you should take. So, the big thing that I wanted to start with this conversation was talking about where this particular approach fails, where it falls apart, what the cracks are in this, and kind of have a discussion on whether or not we should make changes to it. I personally think that we should. But I wanted to go ahead and reach out and have the conversation with other folks in the industry to kind of get a sense for if others feel the same or kind of get feedback from them. So, setting the stage really quick, we're talking about in this specific instance, this is a real case, identifying details removed. We're talking about a $250 million company, rapid growth stage. They've invested heavily in customer success, following kind of this standard model. Multiple layers of leadership. They've got four tiers: your tier one or enterprise, tier two being your medium size and your high growth tier, tier three being your kind of small business, your SMBs. And sorry, your tier two being your mid market, excuse me. And so your tier three, and then there's a tier four that's support only. And now even tier three is on a queue system. So it's by far, it's pyramid shaped. So your tier four and your tier three are the largest teams, both the vast majority of customers, the highest volume of conversations, the highest number of CSMs. Then your tier two, and then your tier one is the smallest by far, with the smallest number of customers who are the highest dollar and the highest touch, and your tier two being somewhere in the middle, where you've got a good sized team with a good sized base of customers who are somewhere between high touch and kind of high dollar. So that's your maximum engagement is your tier two and tier one, and your maximum dollar is your tier one. Now, kind of that standard approach assumes that your tier one customers need a different kind of service than other tiers. And that's debatable, right? But it also assumes that only your tier one CSMs should touch that tier. And this is assuming that there's a really, really high dollar amount there. There's an expectation of higher service, an expectation of a more complex product relationship. Now, that's kind of setting the stage here. So that's where we are. $250 million company, and their tier one was, I believe, four members, and there was a fifth brought on board. But then all of a sudden, you end up with a team of one because they lose four tier one CSMs within a couple months. And this is a point where, because of the tiering structure, because of the recruitment process, it's very, very difficult to replace your tier ones. And you can't hand your tier one customers just to any other tier because the other tiers are not trained on the same business approach as your tier ones. So, this whole entire process is built with the assumption that you have different skill sets for the different levels, different customer approaches for the different levels. And I kind of get where that's coming from, right? So if you have a $500,000 account, that's going to be a different status than your $10,000 account or your $5,000 account. And there's a lot to unpack there, but that's the standard practice assumes enterprise, extra level, extra expertise, higher level person. That makes it hard to recruit. That makes it hard to train these folks. And then also it means that if you lose any of your tier one customer success managers, you're really vulnerable with your highest ARR customers all being at risk all at once. And especially in a case like this, we're talking about a quarter of the total revenue of this company in significant risk basically overnight. And there's no quick or easy way to fix that problem. So that's where we are. So we're looking at that. And so I started the conversation. So talking about scaling a customer success team and having that big conversation about it, talking about the different tiers, enterprise, mid-market, SMB, and then maybe the fourth tier for your single license users or your small users. And I say at a minimum, they're not working the way they're supposed to, and at worst, they're just wrong. So I'm specifically talking about the vulnerabilities here and the reasons why this standard approach is a little bit challenging. And then I'll touch on the approach that I personally prefer. We'll get into that in a second. So typically you have your tier one, and then you've got your other tiers that I just described. And so why is this bad? So just to outline why I personally think this is bad. Number one is you've got silos. You've got expertise silos, you've got team silos. So your CS7 team will all learn different things rather than learning together. And a tier four customer can actually have really major insights that a tier one could benefit from. But if your teams are separated and not working together, there's not really a good way to access that knowledge. So your tier one CSM is actually not learning things that they could be from smaller customers. And your tier four CSM or your tier three CSM is not learning from your tier ones. And both of those can really seriously benefit the total customer pool if they are learning together, learning the same things. Now, of course, if you have routine meetings between the teams, you have kind of expertise sharing or lessons learned sharing going through, that can be a way to reinforce this. But I mean, you can build around that, but it is a vulnerability. Now, second, talent. So the tiered approach makes the absolute statement that some CSMs are better than others to both your internal team and your customers. So it sets up this hierarchy. So instead of being a customer success team, it's your customer success tiers, and that automatically divides it, automatically a vulnerability because it reduces that rapport between your teams. It sets up this kind of very strange dynamic with your customers as well. So this is what I said. The skills translate, and the best people will be good at any tier or multiple tiers. You need anyone on your team to be capable of covering for anyone else. And that's big because even if you didn't lose your tier ones, what if half of your tier one team has a wedding or maternity leave at the same time? Having that be your highest dollar, your highest skill, and smallest tier makes it really, really easy to disrupt. So you either never ever let your tier ones take a break, or you don't have a way to cover for them if something comes up where you obviously have to give them a break. And that's a recipe for burnout. That's a recipe for losing your top talent because you're giving them the most difficult work with the longest time with the fewest options to cover. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities at that level. Um, yeah, and if you tier aggressively, it makes recruitment and retention a nightmare because you're looking for this hyper specific skill set, this kind of upper level CSM. So you're not just looking at a pool of customer success managers with experience who can handle the product and handle your customers. You're looking for subsets of that pool, which makes that hiring and retention dramatically more difficult when it really doesn't need to be. And we've got customer movement. This is a fun one. So this is something I've encountered a lot when I worked with superintendents. And superintendents are very much like C-suite executives. They will frequently move, and often you'll have someone move from a smaller district to a bigger district, a smaller company, bigger customer. And you could easily have a tier three jumping to a tier two or even a tier one. So a contract could change. A tier one contact may move to a small market business. A tier four contact may be promoted to mid market or even tier one. Either one will be a huge slap in the face if they see their treatment change after a move. So you have a tier one used to that level of service, suddenly they go to a tier two and they're like, wait a minute, this is different. You're treating me so much differently because of this. And then what was an advocate or an upsell situation can immediately turn into a detractor. Good luck winning that back. Another note that I may make in a minute is also that you can have situations where a customer really likes their customer success manager, they have a long established relationship. They find out that if they upsell, they will actually lose that relationship and go to a different customer success manager. Now you can force that, you can sell that, but you will have cases where some of your best upsells don't upsell because they don't want to lose that relationship. That's the strength of relationship you're going for, but also that's a problem for obvious reasons. If you're looking at account doubling in size and choosing not to because of that relationship piece, that's a challenge. And then I already touched on this, but recruitment and retention, which I mentioned here that I said it twice. Aggressive tiering, a difference in how customers are treated, a difference in how portfolios are organized tier to tier, makes it dramatically harder to find the right people, train them consistently, and keep them or replace them if needed. That coverage issue also goes to a workflow and training issue, also goes to a consistency of product and service issue. The smaller that team is, the more personality dependent it is, and it gets so much harder to replace your tier ones. So if you're looking at organizing this team, I'm sure you can already hear all of the kind of downsides to having this aggressive tier one. And I'm mostly focusing again on that tier one. But something I don't mention, well, actually, I get to it in a second here. Um, so most upsells in your tier two. So your tier two has the highest dollar growth. more often than not. Although you do get upsells in tier one that are big, they're fewer and far between. So they are big, they're significant, but they're less common, where you'll have constant upsells in your tier two, just because of that broader base of customers with that more growth potential. And then your lowest growth is in tier one. Of course, you want to keep that because it's your highest recurring revenue. But the biggest upsell potential is in your tier three because your tier threes can have the most growth because they're starting at the smallest. And your company advocates and detractors can be in any tier. That's a key piece I wanted to make sure to mention because even if it's a small company, you could have like a social media influencer that's a tier three leader, and they could be talking you up, or they could be talking about how bad their experience is, which will hurt you all the way up to your tier one. Now, so that's just kind of the weaknesses of the current system, just laying out some of that. And just to dig into this a little bit, there were a lot of conversations from a lot of different people here. So depends on your business model or structure. How many products do you have? One product or more than one? Yeah, of course. One of the things I wanted to highlight in this conversation is it's going to be very company specific, which is again part of why we're having the conversation in the first place, because there is not just one approach to customer success. And I think as an industry, we've fallen into assuming that there is. It's easier, it's faster. Somebody getting started in customer success, a company building customer success for the first time, can comfortably jump in and say, oh, this is the template, this is what I do. But that may or may not work. And that's why we're having the conversation in the first place. Let's see. Do you sell a product that's renewed monthly, yearly, or multi-year? Sure. First, you tier on current revenue. Customer spending 1 million is getting a different level of service than a customer paying 10,000. Sure. You're going to tier by revenue, but the second point is the caveat on revenue potential. If we have a 25K customer that offered huge potential, they go into a higher tier, but to separate these, you call them targeted or some other distinguishable name. Now, that is assuming that you can tell right out of the gate which of your customers are higher growth and higher upsell potential. And in some level, you can, but that's a lot of extra internal work in how you make your tiers. And then you're already not making your tiers by their current contract values. You've already slapped an entire extra layer of complexity on your tiers and your customer base already. And the more complexity you put on this, the more complex it gets and the harder to manage it is. This is no different in any business. The hardest part is that your enterprise and top tier customers are a very small percentage of your total customers, but often offer less revenue potential. Perfect. We want to keep their revenue and growth where we can, so they get a VIP level of service. However, we are going to ID those lower tier customers with huge revenue growth potential and give them a higher level of service than their current revenue calls for. And that is sort of touching on my growth potential between tier one and tier two that I mentioned. But what that's missing is it's not necessarily covering that. Your tier three could also benefit from, could have advocacy in it. You could have a lot of very public advocates who are a lower growth tier, but you still want to make sure that they have a good view of the company. A lot of this could be considered your marketing budget or your future budget. You don't advertise to people on the subway to get every single possible passenger. You advertise on the subway to get your decent, like your ideal customer base. And the same is true of customer success. You don't want to play favorites. You don't want to give differentiated treatment on this level because you never know necessarily who's going to be your next big customer and who they're going to hear about this from. And there's a limit to that. You don't, obviously, you can't give everyone the full tier one white glove treatment, but you can get close. And the thing is about giving a consistency of company representation that makes all of your customers feel valued and be willing to advertise and talk up the company. And all of that does lead to revenue growth in less obvious ways. But that's one of the reasons that customer success is so important and why focusing purely on the ARR and putting things in tiers based just on that is going to weaken your total revenue potential. And that's kind of the goal I'm getting at here. Okay, so we had a reply there. Let's see, I said, if your team has a small number of people taking on the most valuable customers, then if even one of your people leaves, it's extremely hard to move their customers, especially if the bulk of the CSM team has been trained differently and not on how to interact with their tier one, which I already said. If your team's ARR is top heavy, then you're neglecting your highest growth potential customers. Because to make a tier three portfolios worth the cost of CSM attention, you have to pile them too high with lower ARR customers, risking all of those relationships and risking losing good experienced CSMs to burnout. Two things on that in terms of your team structure. If you're looking at your tier ones being the highest effort, hardest work on your highest qualified CSMs, that's a ton of pressure on them to not want to keep doing this work because it's the hardest work, the most complex work, the most of the most complex work. And then the flip side is that their portfolios obviously justify the high wage scale of a tier one. So your tier ones are being paid more to handle this because they are generating more revenue every single year or protecting more revenue every single year. But that leaves all of your other tiers being what they talk about being cost centers. So it's harder to justify the increased level of training and investment in most of your customer success team because all of the ARR or that annual revenue is concentrated in the top. And we'll get back to that. Mixed tiers make it much easier to move enterprise customers if needed between your customer success managers, and it takes a ton of the ARR weight off of your average CSM. And we'll get onto that more in a minute. Let's see, too much variation to give a single answer in my opinion. Do I think tiering customers is inherently bad? No. Do I think it's implemented poorly? Definitely, sure. Depends massively on your product and market, as everything does. Right. Again, kind of the point of this whole conversation. My very simplistic take is it makes more sense to focus on customers with scope for growth, new customers, and also at-risk customers that are savable. Those are priorities. So that right there is talking about a whole different priority approach that usually is baked into your customer success team and strategy. Like if you get your risk categories and you can tier them differently based on those risk categories. And then you've got those new customers, of course, you want to start off really well because a very strong onboarding process, a very strong initial training process is a really good indicator for multi-year continued success. And that's really good. Let's see. So I talked about, yeah, and I think some of these I replied where I wasn't. It was late at night and I was replying to these and trying to get through these. So I may not have replied in a way that fully acknowledged the reply. So I really appreciate everyone that was involved in this conversation. And this is one of the really cool, fun things about doing this on Reddit is you get really nitty-gritty conversations with people from all over the world in different industries. And shout out to Howison Ford and funny joke. The first one, fan representative 977. These are Reddit usernames, but yeah. Let's see. So talk about the focusing on customers with the scope for growth. Most tiering systems give top tier service to the current highest ARR, who often have the least upsell potential. Secondary priority at best goes to your tier two and tier three customers, who, as active engaged customers with room to grow, are the ones I personally think should get more focus. But even then, more focus isn't exactly the word because I think that every customer tier should get a baseline level of customer success. Because again, I've made several points about why all of your customer tiers are very important for the long term growth and success of the company. And I also think it does a lot of harm to the structure and stability of a CS team internally to have this level of siloing. And then understood and agree with you. My comment was thinking from an IC perspective, and let's say my own book tiering and tiering within. Highest ARR customers get enterprise CSM. I guess it depends on how high that ARR is and how high it is relative to your customers. And that's going to vary a lot company by company. If you have $500 accounts all the way up to $10 million accounts, the math gets weird. But we can get into that. I really think this is the origin of CS as a move to subscription-based software over evergreen licenses and huge implementation to make sure they keep paying, which, yes, I mean, that's kind of the point. You don't want to do a single lifetime sale of your Photoshop when you can provide better service long term and have a more successful company long term by making it a subscription service. Of course, it has to be a product that makes sense as a subscription service, uh, which leans heavily on the service, which is where we get to customer success. And customer success is the beating heart of SaaS. It is why software as a service makes sense because it is the service piece. It is actually delivering on the promises of the product and the industry. Anyway, the more I think of it, yeah, it warrants the silos. Okay. And then we get to this. Okay, and here we go. There's a little bit of follow-up here. So going back to my original setting, I think reducing it to the silos being the issue is the wrong approach. So was it a problem with the silos? I would argue yes, because the siloing put so much extra pressure on the upper tier, and then the siloing is why losing those people was so bad. So that's two very simple points of why that tier one loss hurt so bad, because these are the people put under the most pressure, the most likely to leave, and then everyone else was not trained to replace them. So that is two just very, very short, very brief reasons why I think that the tier one process, especially, is a problem. But then also the tier two and tier three already had such a volume of customers at relatively low ARR that they are putting in so much work relative to the amount of annual value each of their portfolios brings in. So you've got a recipe for really extreme burnout at both ends. You've got overworked, undervalued, and then you've got overworked, potentially overvalued. Uh, and that can be balanced on both ends. Let's see, why not post about employee retention? And that all of this feeds back into employee retention. Let's see, salary and benefits, and that does matter, but doesn't matter as much as workflow because there's always going to be somebody willing to pay more for a skilled tier one CSM. Then you've got culture, career progression, and yes, I mean, a huge turnover in your tier one does point to a larger systemic issue. But other examples here too. You've got five CSMs, right? One goes on vacation, one quits, one gets fired, one goes on maternity leave. That's basically your entire tier one team all at once for reasons that are going to happen. And it wasn't because four out of the five chose to leave at the same time. That's enough of a risk and more of a constant risk than any like single significant event. This particular event just sort of called attention to this process. Let's see. And so we're talking about pods here, better cross-role collaboration. And this is talking about I'd structure one enterprise CSM per five mid-market and then five small market per manager on a team lead. So I have pods, which does kind of help cross-train, but it still has all of the issues with that enterprise CSM being that unique skill set with unique challenges to their portfolio. Let's see. I hate kids. So this is an interesting one, and I got called out here, so I want to make sure to show this. Um, I'm fairly new to CS. My employer is thinking of scaling from a regional model to a tiered model. What would you suggest to provide the most equity for both staff and customers? And I've engaged on Reddit for a really long time. Actually, I'll get to that. So I was called out here talking about I don't want to give away the full piece because I want to put more of this into a separate post. And I was immediately called out by Fee Fi Fo Plum, excellent character, great personality, saying, if you're here to be helpful, just answer the question. Because I got -7 votes on that, which I deserved. And that's a cautionary tale about Reddit. It's a really good community for engaging in this kind of conversation, but you do need to respect the community and how it works. And I didn't in this case. So I fully acknowledge that, appreciate the call out, and then talked about kind of where I'm coming from. Um, yeah, if I'm being a posturing bleep, I can only hope someone in the room will always stand up and say so. So there we go here. So the short version I said is what we're going to get to in a second. And this is Fraslin here said, strong disagree with this and mixing customer sizes. What happens, and this is a very common refrain that came up a lot from a lot of people who responded to this conversation, and why there's tiering in the first place is that some accounts will get overserviced and some will be ignored. Okay. It's often difficult for a CSM to shift gears and differentiate their service level. Now, that's speculation, number one, for that second part, which is true. It can be difficult to switch tiers. If you are answering short, small questions from one customer, and then you've got a QBR with $1 million customer coming up next, it can be challenging to switch gears. But that's true of any of this. If you're switching customer to customer, you're already switching gears. So I disagree kind of on that point. It is challenging, but it's a core part of the role. And the other part of this is some accounts will get overserviced and some will be ignored. And that is the problem with tiering in the first place. Because if you're losing people, if they're taking a break, you can't appropriately cover their customers because you don't have a way to hand those off. And then also, I personally believe that your tier ones often are overserviced. And that's another kind of core part of the conversation. And I've already touched on why the full customer portfolio is important, and we'll get back to that. Quiet enterprise accounts end up being ignored, and smaller squeaky wheel customers will be overserviced. And that, a lot of the counterpoint to this whole approach, and I get it, I understand, but a lot of the counterpoint to this whole approach is talking about how these expectations of what will and won't happen in these relationships. And all of these speak to problems that happen with customer success anyway. So these are problems you'll already have to deal with. So I don't give a lot of weight to this kind of problem because that's the same argument quiet any account versus squeaky wheel any account. That's something that as customer success teams and managers, we have to understand and adapt for. Um, Nothing's absolute, and it can be a model for some smaller teams. Now, I didn't we'll get back to that. But this is a very common like framing and a very common feedback that a lot of people replied to on this post on this topic. On both this one and the follow-up we'll touch on in a second that doesn't have as many comments. We'll do that a little bit faster. But yeah, a couple points here. This doesn't address any of the challenges with the current tiering system. So this is defending the current system without giving any way to compensate for the challenges that we've already discussed, the way that it falls short, the problem we have, and then defaulting to can be a model for some smaller teams and some product types. I heard that a lot, and in this specific instance, this is a big company. We said 20 million, and I mean, it's not that big compared to some other industries, but this is a big company. And we're talking about a lot of customers, multiple very, very complex products, where the implementation between small and big is a matter of scale, but not necessarily a matter of complexity. So a tier three customer success manager has the product expertise and knowledge to manage a tier one just fine. And I would argue that coming into the conversation as a paid product expert and somebody that knows how to work with customers in general is the most transferable skill set between tier one and tier three and everything in between. So, whenever people talk about them being different skill sets, there is some level of that true, but not enough to justify having completely separate tiers based on that alone. That's a training issue, that's a recruitment issue, but I would argue fairly strongly that the difference between tier one and tier three is not as dramatic as it's being held up to be here. And also, you don't want upper and lesser teams. You want your customer success team to be a strong, interactive team that can step in and help each other. And that's where it will grow the best. That's where it will be the strongest. That's where you'll get the best training, the best culture, and the best scalability. If you have a team of 10 people, all of whom are more or less on par, you can have different pay scales and different like growth incentives. There's a lot of different ways to address that, and we'll touch on that. But if you have a team of 10 that's all able to interact with new people and bring them in as equals all at once, and each of them has different personality types, different strengths, and they're able to feed off each other and have this really wildly successful group, that's so much more effective than new people coming in. You go to this team, you go to this team, you go to this team, and each of them has a different onboarding experience. That's going to kill culture. That's going to give you wildly different outcomes for every single person brought on. It's going to give you dramatically different, like swinging wild changes between the tiers because they're going to be culturally different. And one of the conversations I'm having the most right now is about startup teams and rapid growth teams having trouble with scaling, culture, internal achievement. And all of that is made worse by tiering because of siloing. So, anyway, that was a tangent. We'll get back to that. But I did want to go ahead and talk about this part to address a lot of the concerns that we just heard from Fraslin about squeaky wheels getting over serviced and the quiet customers not being serviced. One of the single best metrics of work that I've ever seen that I personally followed is just saying, have you had a two-way conversation with this customer within the last 30 to 60 days? That being the goal. So, like, if you have a quiet customer, you better talk to them because that's one of your top KPI, top success metrics. And it's always surprising to me that that's not like your number one metric on other teams. Because if we were to really distill down customer success, it's picking up the phone and talking to your customers. Um, Metaphorically, whatever, however you talk to your customers, however they want to be talked to, but having two-way conversations with your customers regularly, building a cadence, having this whenever something comes up, you are the first person they think of and you're the first call they make. That is kind of the core of customer success. And this whole idea that basic two-way communication isn't your number one priority is always surprising to me. And we're not talking about like checking in on someone's dog and like sending baby pictures. There is some strategy behind it, which is another common conversation this month. But open communication, like you reach out and say, "Hey, I talked to this customer. They had this solution. I thought that would be applicable to you." Or, "Hey, I saw this thing," or, "We put out this new feature. I saw this new workflow." There's always something productive and strategic to reach out about them. Because the more you talk to them, the more you understand where they are coming from, what their priorities are, what their goals are, and the more they get used to hearing from you and trusting what you have to say. That is all built into that, like frequent, regular, sometimes short, sometimes not communication, and how important that is to customer success running well. Okay, so that is a really big thing here. I, yeah, this common complaint or common objection I heard a lot. We're going to see it a lot more still. I believe this is accurate if your product is the same across various market segments. And that can be true because sometimes a product is actually different at tier one. The thing is, though, if that's true, I personally really think that all of your tiers should be very clearly aware of what that difference is. And so servicing different people is important. In every single customer success team I've been on, there's been some level of multiple products. So half your customers at product one, half your customers at product two, some in the middle have both, and then there's upsells or changes to each of those as well. You very rarely have a single product customer success team. So here we go. If MM and ENT clients tend to have more complex offerings at a greater scale, you do yourself a disadvantage by not tiering. Again, I think that's debatable, but for instance, on my team, our SMB clients do not have the same configurations. So we need a team of CSMs who are well trained to handle the client's complexity and scale. Right. I'm not going to have someone in my SMB team have a portfolio with a single location mom and pop and then a 100 location multi operator franchise. They will inevitably ignore the smaller accounts. Disagree. Again, talking about communication with all of your customers being the top priority. Another thing, too, is if you have one customer reach out with a bug or reach out with a feature request, it is extremely unlikely that that is the only customer who's having that conversation. And if you're able to say, hey, I talked to this mom and pop shop last week, they already suggested this feature or a very similar one. So we're already on it. I really appreciate you bringing it up. If you come to a tier one conversation having said, like we've talked about that feature, we're actively working on and discussing it, doesn't matter where that came from. That is valuable insight you can bring to anyone in your portfolio. And again, I would argue that in a lot of cases, these smaller customers are actually very, very creative with where and how they use your products, and they can still inform the big customers in ways that you otherwise won't know. Again, that is, of course, going to vary by customer base, by product, sure. And a lot of people have different experiences. And this again, I talked about the 30, 60 days communication, that two-way cadence, so that invariably ignore XYZ customers is a non-issue. Let's see. If the biggest customers are that much more complex, you'll have to have integrations and a professional services team backing up those CSMs anyway. And that's a big point too. This company that lost all their tier ones, they had a really, really strong professional services, really strong integrations team, really strong support team. They had those tertiary teams to help do the heavy lifting that made the biggest difference between tier one and tier two. So there already was a support network in place to help compensate for the differences between the tiered customers, um, which I think goes a long way to cover the differences in being a customer success manager supporting these. The common one company that I worked for very heavily did phone system integrations, connecting the calling and email, outgoing social media accounts for um, companies of various sizes. Of course, your mom and pop shop has a much easier integration with fewer phone numbers, whereas your enterprise level client, it's different and you learn to scale that differently. But the thing is, if you have a $50,000 customer and a $30,000 customer, it's unlikely those are going to be in different tiers, but they will have dramatically different needs and how they use it, how they integrate with it, which tools they're integrating. So there's already a lot of variety in workflow and what people are doing and how. I don't think that's an argument for tiering either, unless we're talking like really, really, really different. But then again, you have those extra teams, your integration, your professional services, and your training teams that can help fill in that gap. Let's see. Here we go. And this is a really interesting one, and I wanted to make sure to highlight this. I've started to distribute the tier one workloads across the department so that our key accounts have a lead CSM with an associate CSM in a supporting role. This allows the associate CSM to have hands on experience supporting our most complex clients under the supervision of a lead. It's the way to I bridge the gap between my two teams, very nice, and turn the team supporting lower ARR clients into a training ground for tier one. We all have our own way of running our teams. Mine works well with all the nuances we have. We have 20 different products that can be configured in a ton of different ways. Whoa. So it's easier for me to have a team that is trained specifically for the products and configurations the higher end clients are using. I don't have the training resources or time to train every CSM on every product and configuration and ensure that they are all serving clients properly. This was awesome. So this is a case where I'm really glad I poked the bear because that workflow is something I've never heard anyone else talk about, and it is really good. So this like associate CSM supporting the tier ones, there you have coverage, you have familiar faces that have already been brought in, you've got multiple people servicing your really heavy accounts. You have built-in coverage, you have a built-in training ground, you have a built-in way to move these customers' account if there's disruption in your teams. That is an excellent solution and I wanted to make sure to really focus on that one because if if my next follow-up part goes completely flat, this is a place to go back to as a really good workflow that can help support kind of the gaps in the current tiering system. Huge shout out to Deuterian for bringing that one up. That was a really good. That's one of my favorite comments. So I'm glad I poked a bit and pressed it until I got to that reply. Looking at Ailstra's, you're dead on about the silos. And there's Reddit is an interesting space. There are some kind of funny built-in advertising because this is like, oh look, boom, AI agent ad. Ta-da! And this is talking about, I believe, Easel AI. Let's see. You're dead on about silos. It's a huge problem. Your T1 CSMs get locked into babysitting stable accounts where your T3 is sitting on a gold mine of feedback and upsell signals they can't act on. Yeah. The whole system exists because you can't afford to give every customer a dedicated human. So you tier. Right. And that's a big Tiering itself is an imperfect solution to a big problem in how to manage these accounts. Just to go ahead and say that, this nailed that. I work at Easel AI, and these guys are doing a really interesting job doing sneaky advertising on Reddit. Easel AI is a really interesting product I'm looking into, and I wanted to make sure to shout that out and note that some of these personalities are actually AI bots and potentially ads, and it's hard to tell that. But just wanted to shout that out. This may not be. I've also spoken personally to several people from Easel who are actively on Reddit making these conversations. I work at Easel AI, and we see different approaches working. You use an AI agent to provide that tier one responsiveness to everyone. It handles the simple stuff 24/7 across all customer segments. This lets your human CSMs function as one team of experts who can focus on high value work, whether that's a complex renewal for an enterprise client or a huge expansion op with a smaller customer. AI agents are going to be a whole conversation by themselves. But if I were to sum this up, I have not seen a good system that uses an AI agent tool that is trained really, really well and is correctly able to tell the difference between what is an escalation and what's not. If you're going to do that, you should probably have an agent working side by side with a human. So that human is keeping one eye on the AI agent so that they can follow and jump in live as needed. It is, with that workflow, actually incredibly helpful, and that could work really well. But yeah, anyway. And Scarf and Greens had some really good comments here too. Excuse me, Scarf and Greenies. Yes, like this is what I want us to move to. Using our data to have common sense signals relevant to our customers and product that we can act on. I find that many in the sub seem to use very different surface level metrics just because they're industry standard, big inspiration for the conversation, but they don't actually account for the uniqueness of their product, of their customers, and their organization. Again, nailed it right back to the whole focus of the conversation being that there is a standardized approach to customer success that not enough people are questioning and designing for their specific workflow. There's my cat. You knew that in the background. Like our CSMs do not know how to keep track of NPS. That only appears in QA calls, which a separate team owns. Direct questions about renewal sentiment, looking at adoption, looking at ticket trends, past risk, and payment history, probably the biggest indicators that we're losing someone because of product or cost. But no one is looping all of this together. And that's one of the single biggest pieces of AI is being able to say, summarize this account for me, and boom, goes through like latest conversation, adoption, NPS score history, key highlights of conversations. The way that AI is able to go through massive amounts of data per customer and summarize it is incredibly powerful. But that only works if the AI integrates directly with your chat service and your CRM and wherever you're logging those conversations, which none of them that I'm aware of do. They're all kind of standalone processes that plug in a little bit here and there. But you would need one that can plug into Salesforce, Gainsight, HubSpot, Intercom for support chats, everything. And that is asking a lot. I'm curious to see these work and see them evolve to that point. That's going to be a big point, but that's the moment I'm waiting for, really. And a built-in Salesforce AI can touch some of that. A built-in HubSpot can touch some of that. And if it's only in a single platform, the efficiency gain there is potentially an incentive to put everything in that single platform, just so that that agentic AI can be used to fill in the gaps that you have by not having multiple platforms. Tangent. Good tangent. Great points. A big part of me coming at this question at all is that tiering is the assumed go-to approach. If you're setting up CS, it's basically what every voice out there tells you to do. Like I said, I want to make sure at a minimum that we're talking about other approaches and taking a close look at the downsides of this approach too. Ta-da, look at me. Most of the voices in the space haven't been at it for all that long. Maybe haven't seen extremely rapid customer growth or high internal turnover, or had the same relationships for multiple years. I think my record is I've had some customer relationships for over 8 years running and still consistent relationships. And that was, I mean, if you get to that point with a customer, that is a phenomenal level of connection. You learn a lot by having that deep business customer relationship that you don't have if you haven't had that before. The math can change a lot as you go through the different relationship waves. Let's see. So I agree, coming from a company that doesn't do tiering in the traditional sense. We all have large, medium, and small names in our books, which we'll talk more about this in a second, but to highlight the benefit there is you have customer success managers with a portfolio that has a raw number of contacts that makes sense. So if we're talking about like the maximum number of live conversations your CSMs are going to have with a human, you're looking around the 80 companies range. So having that live conversation, keeping track of everyone, you're talking about 80 per CSM, which is cost prohibitive if your portfolios are all SMB or smaller customers. if you want your portfolios to make sense, you really do kind of need them to. Ooh, we may have to pause real quick. One sec. There we go. Pardon, my computer was dying there. Huh. Yes, so I've talked too much clearly and put my computer to sleep. Okay. So one of the biggest incentives for a mixed portfolio is that very raw number of the total dollar amount you get per year per customer success manager. There is that cutthroat stable teams thing where you do want to make sure that this makes financial sense. You have to make sure that your customer success managers are bringing in enough money to justify the cost on tools, the cost on training, cost on salary. And if you have your split tiers where so much of your money is in your tier one, then you end up having budget CSMs and support below that. And you are undervaluing their skill set, you're undervaluing them. You get burnout and churn because you're putting too many accounts that are not worth enough for everything to work out. So if we're talking from a company strategy standpoint, somebody made a comment about a CFO that's coming up soon here. If you're talking purely in terms of the economics of your teams, you want every CSM to have a portfolio that's high enough dollar to justify paying them appropriately for the amount of work that they're putting in, and to extra, ideally to the point where they give truly exceptional service, where they are supported and able to do all of this for the good of your company and for your customers, and of course for their own good as well. Happy CSMs make all the difference in the world. And if you're burning them out, if you're going through them and not training them well because your portfolios are not valuable enough to justify investing in them, that's a problem by itself. So, doesn't do tiering in the traditional sense. We have large, medium, and small names in our books. We do have customers segmented into a mild version of this tiering system, but the service we're expected to give remains consistent across all. Great approach. I already have my own reservations about our system just because I think segmentation, not only for my company but for others, couldn't be based on spend, but based on the kind of service and support the customer wants and or is best fitted for. And the easiest way to do that is based on pure dollar amount, but that's not necessarily what you should be doing. You could have different levels of support based on the complexity of products. You could have it based on their growth potential, on which specific products they get. Like if they're not doing the phone integration system I was talking about, they're a dramatically simpler customer and don't need the same level of support, even if they're paying more than a small customer that is doing the phone integration, for example. For example, I have customers who are getting scaled service from me because they just don't need me that much. They're high health, self sufficient, mature, reach out to me or tech support when it's needed, and willingly engage with our programming while remaining communicative for when I reach out. And I love that. That's a stable CSM relationship. That is awesome. That speaks highly of the tier in the company. But I have other customers who, even if they said they wanted the same style, I would push back because they're not strong enough for me to feel confident they'll make progress without the project management and support we typically give. They're all paying customers at the end of the day. All dollars matter, otherwise sales wouldn't have been expected to seek them in the first place. And this comment really stood out as a very thoughtful comment that covers multiple levels of the conversation. This is really good. And the biggest concern here isn't it's not worth it. They'll be ignored. It's this level of like, to do this job well and do this job right and to make sure these customers are strong customers, X, Y, and Z. This is a really, really like that one stands out. Um, yes. And here we got on the end here. Our customers paid extra for tier one support and their CSM. All of the customers were divided up based on spend. If you don't pay for premium support, you're lumped in a CSM queue of 20 to 30 customers. And that's still a pretty small queue of customers, so that's still pretty good. Um, that kind of makes sense where you are charging customers for the extra level of support that you offer in tier one. But the downside to that is that one of the single biggest advantages to customer success is it is universal. It is the face of your company. It is here is what we do because we care about our customers. If you had any level of nickel and diming to that, where you're charging for in person training or you're charging for other things, somewhere along the line, the value doesn't add up and it becomes transactional and there's a bad taste to it, as opposed to having your general sort of broad, very powerful customer success being like, we take care of our customers because, not we will take care of you if you pay us enough. And you can immediately tell the difference there. Of course, I oversold it, but you can tell the difference in company approach. Like, we'll give you support if you pay for it, or we will give you support because we care about our product and our customers. One is really good marketing, and the other is going to fall at least half flat because you've already kind of primed the conversation not to be a positive one. Now, here's the follow up. And this is where I was talking about my actual approach, like the way that I personally prefer to structure customer success teams. Let's see. Key advantages of having a flat or mixed tier portfolio. Number one, organized portfolios by ARR is just how you do it, or the way that I personally prefer to do it. So every customer success manager has approximately the same dollar value spread out between the different sizes of customers. The goal being a similar dollar value for everyone with around that 80 customer cap. And if you've got enterprise customers mixed in there, just a couple in there, that gives that customer success manager a really good padding on their total ARR. But you still make sure that you get that consistent level of service. You've got a high end customer success manager over that entire portfolio. Next, mixed customer sizes. Each individual team member should have some enterprise, mostly mid market, and upper end small market business. Create the flat team structure, and you can have pod or team leads. You'll need to, and then but it still is a single team with the same level of expectations, the same approaches, shared knowledge base, shared work base, shared experience base. Everyone in that team is working together as a team, even if they have individual pods for kind of more in-depth collaboration. Depending on your product, single license or very low ARR customers can be in a no touch or support only tier. And that's where it gets tricky because I literally just said that you want to offer this approach to your customers just because for everyone. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. And shout out back to Dan Reese, who invented customer success at Paperturn, if you haven't heard of this one. He actually has a no touch tier. And that's because it is a software product where you have high-end multi-license, multi-user versions, or you have a single user who bought a single license. Think like Canva, where there's a marketing team version and then there's a one person doing projects on the side version. And so it really makes sense to have a no-touch tier. You want some level of engagement with them. You want to have support. You want to have places they can reach out for help because you never know when that small no-touch person is going to become a bigger customer. So you want to have that be a constant conversation where you're always looking at like where is growth coming from, who are the zero touches we're losing, who are the ones that are staying and growing. You want to keep an eye on that as best you can, but not devote that to slots in someone's portfolio where they reach out to live. If I'm using Canva once a week to make a YouTube thumbnail, I obviously don't want someone to reach out and be like, "Did you know that you could pay a whole marketing team worth for this?" So you can kind of see where the different approach makes sense for different customers and different products. Getting to why. So we've touched on this a lot, but the short answer is flexibility. Like I said, every hire is a CSM. Everybody you recruit, everybody you bring on board is a customer success manager with a similar expectation of skill set, experience. Everyone will benefit from having a very experienced, very tight knit team with a broad base of people who can all answer the same questions, all of whom have worked with every single scale of customer. So that immediately gives you a lot more stability, a lot more depth of experience and training, a better onboarding, better welcoming experience, easier and better recruitment process. There are so many advantages to that by itself. Everyone in the team gets experience at every customer level. Any CSM can cover for any other CSM. Any account can be moved to any other portfolio. The ability to reshuffle accounts at will freely between CSMs, that answers all the issues I was talking about with vacation coverage, maternity leave, turnover from your tier ones. It just is so much better risk management and overall preparation of your entire customer portfolio. Less risk, easier recruitment, and since their tiers are more balanced, less direct stress on your CS team. So you get less burnout, you get less stress of being all of your conversations are the maximum possible effort, or you're running around all day and spending all of your time talking to customers who have very low ARR. You need that balance. You need a good amount of revenue going through each customer success manager with a variety of experience, with a variety of portfolio size, but still kind of aiming for the similar goal. No one will have a pure high touch portfolio. No one will have a pure low ARR portfolio. Every portfolio will be a mix of protecting renewal ARR and high upsell potential. So you don't have people who are benefiting from extra growth. You don't have people who are benefiting from just overwhelming ARR. Any kind of bonus system, any kind of system you have, performance based, will give everyone equal opportunity to get it. This is Now, we'll get to the discussion here, but this is still a follow up to the last piece where I was highlighting the Downsides and problems of the traditional tiered approach, and this is some very significant advantages to this approach. We'll get into this. Um, and this is a big one too. Everyone on the team will have access to customer insights and use cases at every scale. And I was a CSM with a mature portfolio during COVID. And I cannot tell you how many times I was talking to a teeny tiny account in Vermont. And that gave me a really good, effective solution for a huge district in Texas. Like this way where you can cross over experiences and learn from different personalities and different use cases is huge. And that goes across products, that goes across platforms, it goes across teams. Being able to transfer knowledge freely across your internal and external teams has a huge value of its own. Plus, everyone in your CSM team will learn quickly the full difference in what the product does and looks like at tier one and be able to clearly articulate that value to your tier two and tier three customers. So if your tier two customer comes in and says, hey, we want to expand, what does that look like? Everybody in your CSM team will be qualified to fully answer that and say, hey, I worked with this person yesterday. Here's what they're doing you currently don't that you could. Having that level of pitch for your high growth potential customers is huge. And that's something that wasn't addressed in any of the counterpoints to this that I've talked about. Also, if a contact moves anywhere between tier one and three, in just in terms of contract size, they can keep their existing CSM and maintain that strong relationship rather than that incredibly awkward, well, you downgraded your contract, so you don't get me anymore. Or the possibly worse one I mentioned before, you never get a case where a customer chooses not to upsell their contract so they can keep their current CSM relationship. That's the level of CSM relationship you hope to have, and you don't want any incentive for someone to not buy the thing so that they can keep the relationship. In the last post, I called out recruitment and catering for tier one customers. Your tier one CSMs are your most experienced, most likely to be poached, most likely to leave, and the hardest to replace. Then, if you have a whole team of people not trained on handling your top level customers, suddenly you don't have anyone to handle those relationships. And that again, like I haven't seen any other appropriate solution to that problem. There were a few approaches that kind of help address that, and there was that one really good one I called out. But still, so let's go into the conversation here. It's a little bit shorter. The downside is that without specialization, each CSM has to be an expert in everything, which can lead to mediocrity and stagnation. Mediocrity. A flat structure creates issues with career pathing. Recruitment may actually be harder because you're not able to hire true entry level CSMs who are far easier to recruit. Employee retention is harder because you can't reward outstanding CSMs appropriately and are more likely to be poached by companies who reward tier 1 CSMs. Flat structure, like you're proposing, works well in early stage environments, but tiering is required to scale. Also, it seems like you're focused on the CSM and team first and not the retention and growth of the customer. This feels backward to me. Couple points on this. Your pay scale can be based on seniority, it can be based on experience. It doesn't have to be based just on the tiering or the total ARR. There you go. And in terms of the recruitment, I don't think that's true because your onboarding and training will be so much stronger because of that firmer base. Like your internal culture, your internal onboarding, your internal processes will make sense between your different tiers, between all of your customer success managers. It'll be so much easier to build out workflows and playbooks and approaches because everyone has a similarly balanced portfolio. That is one of the biggest challenges of the different tiers because the risk categories are different, the conversations are different, the workflow is different. Having a completely different way to do the job for each of the individual tiers causes a whole lot of extra chaos that makes it much more difficult to manage your internal team. Workflow, training resources, everything is much more different than it needs to be. And also, I would counter this too that this doesn't talk about the volume of work put on tier one CSMs. It's like all those posts you see about your top performer, you keep giving them more work and more work and more work until they leave. They were already the highest compensated, they were already the most rewarded, but because they got all of the hardest possible work, they left. And that's something that this comment doesn't address in the least. And this whole works well in early stage environments, but tiering is required to scale is just not true. That is an absolute statement that I will absolutely denounce because it's just not. And then the focus on the CSM team, the structure and stability of your team, the training resources that they have directly correlates to the experience your customers are having. A healthy, robust, well trained, well supported customer success team is a core piece of what you need to actually take care of your customers. So this whole idea that retention and growth of the customer is not being emphasized here, I don't think that's true. And I think in multiple points of this conversation, I've made clear the importance of value of this to your customer growth. There we go. And then question, why does that automatically lead to mediocrity? Yes, CSMs would all have to have a broader experience base, assuming they aren't already on the same level in terms of product expertise, which if you're training them all consistently across the board, there shouldn't be. Although there's gonna be, just you'll have some people more specialized than others. But there you'll be able to call in people from anywhere on the team. It's like this person's really, really good on this sub product. I'll have them back me up on this specific call. Like being able to collaborate and cooperate in that level also makes your team that much stronger and more robust too, and is live, active training of all of your internal members because they can learn from each other's expertise. Let's see. You can have team or group leadership positions. I also mentioned seniority and compensation based on performance. Like these are things you can certainly do without it just being that tier one level of support. And then also lead trainer positions, specializations, and hopefully coaching internally about where everyone individually wants to move in their next career path. Something that's also very common in CS is your customer success managers don't necessarily want to move from a tier 3 CSM to a tier 1 CSM. Maybe they want to move to an ops role. Maybe they want to move to a product role. Maybe they want to move elsewhere in the company that's not specifically CS. And having that path be from tier 4, T3, T2 to T1 as your kind of exclusive path also doesn't make sense. Yeah. And then here, and in a tiered system, where do tier ones have to go from there, but to another company? And I am focusing the advantage to the team here because that also impacts the customer. High turnover and burnout on a team is the bigger problem I've seen recently, which has a bigger impact on customers than mixed tiers would from the examples that I've seen. Let's see. The mediocrity comment isn't about broad experience. A CSM's job is difficult as it is, and expecting them to adjust to a wide range of customers means they're not able to focus on supporting one tier in the best way possible. I've said a couple times where I don't think that's necessarily true, but instead they average out their efforts and maybe even support the lowest common denominator. There's a maybe, there's a hypothetical. You can build into your workflows and training and support making that not happen. You can compensate for that. Also, you cannot assume all CSMs have the same product knowledge. Of course not. You're supposed to train them on that. You will always have newer CSMs and CSMs that are better than others. Both true. However, if all of your CSMs are on the same level with similar portfolios, they will all learn much faster and be able to draw on each other's experience. Again, you get a better support network that is better able to compensate for individual strengths and weaknesses. If you tier, all of that is still true, but you don't have the fallback. You don't have the level of support. You can't call in a tier one to support a tier three conversation and vice versa. If you have mixed tiers, again, everyone's expertise can be shared evenly, regardless of the call. And yeah, of course, some are going to be better than others, but you can do that with performance based incentives. There's a lot of ways to compensate for that aside from just tiering. As far as a career path is concerned, a tiered structure also has leadership positions and support positions. But with a tiered structure, you can have a leader specialized in SMB, and an SMB CSM can be a lead there. Or they can move to tier one. And depending on the person, they may be better suited to leadership rather than an IC role, individual contributor. But it gives you options, and those options help with employee retention, which again, I don't necessarily see those as being dramatically different options than the different ways you could have leadership, supporting, or expansion roles within mixed tiers as well. There's nothing about those that makes them mutually exclusive. In a flat structure, everyone is like that tier one CSM in your example who doesn't have anything to look forward to if a leadership position doesn't open up. I think I just addressed that. So there is a possibility of turnover, sure, everywhere. And I'd argue that the very best are not going to be happy with the flat structure. So you'll risk the very best CSMs. Whereas if you have a tier one CSM role, the comp can help retain the talent and is justified because they are supporting the most valuable roles. Try getting a CFO to approve higher than average comp for a CSM who does exactly the same thing as any other CSM. And that again, like if you're talking to a CFO, you can make the financial argument about the consistency, support, stability of the team, the stable structure, the consistent training, the support network, the way all of this works together. And chances are you're probably going to be paying these CSMs still a little bit less than your like top 10, top end tier one CSM. So tier one enterprise CSMs may still be paid the highest, but the expectations will be much worse and will be much more prone to burnout. More travel, higher level of high touch customers, a whole lot more expectations that also make that role less desirable than the current tier one approach. It will appeal to some people, but a lot of CSMs don't want that. And it's not just the higher compensation. There's a lot of things that go into that. Um, and I really do think that that CFO argument, you just have to make a different financial pitch. And I think that we could definitely effectively make that in a way that makes financial sense to your C-suite. Additionally, expecting CSMs to support a bigger variety of customers will create more stress and a higher turnover for both staff and customers. If they don't have the support network available, if you make the portfolios too big to be manageable, that is something to constantly keep an eye on no matter what. And the thing is, again, to highlight this, in the current tiering system, tier ones have an insane workload because they have all of the highest demand, highest touch customers. The burnout is really, really aggressive at tier one. Likewise, at tier three, you have so many customers that need support, and you have such low ARR total. You're paid less, you're supported less, you're asked to do more, and it's a fairly thankless role. Your tier threes, they tend to get stepped on a little bit. So, what I'm arguing for evens that out. So, you get better support, healthier portfolios, better workload, so your entire team is more stable and people can be moved and promoted as makes the most sense based on their performance and how they do. Right now, if you were to go into any mature customer success team that is tiered, I would bet you see some rock star performers in your tier three who never get the recognition they should get. And you see some tier ones who are struggling to not crack under the pressure. And many do. I would actually be curious to see if there are metrics on which tiers have the highest turnover. I would bet one and three have approximately equivalent turnover. So again, yeah, you want a stable, healthy internal team that's well trained, that has a lot of long term expertise and good, stable industry knowledge. And I would argue that the mixed tiering approach is a far better way to get that than the extreme tiering. Yeah, you'll have very high ARR customers competing for time with lower ARR customers, which is still true in enterprise. If you have a 1 million and an 800,000, those two are still competing with each other. So that's always true. And those are both high touch, high effort accounts. So it's actually harder to balance that than it is to balance 1 million and then maybe 10, 100,000 accounts. Ultimately, that CSM will choose the high ARR customer at the cost of the low ARR customer. You lose the low ARR customer, missing out on future growth, while stressing the CSM who's been bombarded by the low ARR customer wanting their time. Lose lose. Again, all of this is speculation. Some of it is informed by current experience, but that is assuming there's no support network, assuming the workflow doesn't make sense, and assuming that the tiers aren't balanced in terms of effort versus volume. Another issue is the strategies for supporting smaller customers has to be different than larger customers. That depends a lot on the product and the team. Retention versus growth strategies, high touch versus low touch, the ability to see trends within the tier, differentiated product development for each tier, etc. Ultimately, this is the biggest problem as the team structure should be based on customer needs and not the other way around. And again, I don't think the tiering approach does base on customer needs. I don't think it does because everyone is fundamentally using the same products. Different ways, different scales, but a lot of the actual experience they have day to day is crossed over. A lot of the user experience day to day is crossed over. And one of the things too is that if you have a tier one customer, that tier one customer is having day-to-day experiences that cross all of the tiers. There are tier three people or tier three level users at tier one enterprise level customers and the more strategic leadership at the top. You need to understand every level of that experience. And if you have an enterprise level customer that has like 100 sort of lower level users who are the ones actually using the product day to day, their feedback is going to inform the opinion that leader has of your product and your company. You won't know how to deal with that. You won't know how to acknowledge that if you have not worked with the hands on users at that lower level who are influencing the decisions of that upper level leader. So there's a lot of crossover again in the skills and the different ways the products are used between tier three and tier one. And I mean, this is a very consistent piece of feedback we've heard standing up for the current tiers. This argument that there will be mediocrity, that there won't be any incentive for CSMs to work this way, that it won't meet customers' needs. And I think there's a lot of different ways to address that, company by company, team by team, product by product. And I don't think tiers are the best approach because there's nothing worse for a customer than going from having a tier one CSM to having no CSM. And that again is one of the most significant risks here is losing people because they get burnt out by the high touch. And you already have a mix of high versus low touch customers. That's going to vary regardless of contract size. Yeah, let's see. My personal view is team structure has to reflect both customer needs and team needs. Cracks in the team will reflect on your customer experience. And gaps in customer experience will reflect back on the team. You need to prioritize both. Yes, I spend most of my day triaging customer success teams that are struggling in various different ways. And two of the recurring themes are internal burnout and turnover. Hence why so much of the focus here is on internal structure because that's addressing one of the current major problems. But the main driver is just having the conversation, right? It's clear here in the thread and in the industry as a whole that the tiering process, as is the go to model. And I haven't seen a real conversation anywhere about why, what other approaches there might be, and how to resolve some of the key issues with that assumed approach. The detailed reply. Appreciate everybody who took the time to reply to this, and I hope I'm not being dismissive of their commentary because they are coming to this from a perspective of people who've done the job, who understand their product and company, and are looking at this in a way that has worked for them. I just want to make sure to have the full conversation. Okay, and here's another one. The problem here with this is everything becomes average. The CSM is not specialized, rather a generic or average CSM, which most of the times will hurt their career. Also, the experience for the customer also most likely becomes mediocre. Now, I am maybe completely wrong here, and if this works for you, great, do it. I mean, it's again this assumption that like, well, we've done it this way. This is clearly the industry standard. Any other approach might be wrong. And that's one of the biggest risks of having an industry standard approach is that it does discount other strategies and policies that are potentially much more effective. Potentially. And why? There are still team lead positions or other promotions. You can do commissions, longevity raises, management tracks. What is it about tiering that makes any of that better? And even in the cases where people are standing up for tiering, I haven't seen really coherent articulation as to why, except things like compensation and growth potential, and about the needs of the customer. And in my experience with mixed portfolios, I found it far more effective to have that than it was to have the tiered approach for both the upsides of having the very stable, broad experience based team, but then also for having less of that risk that came of losing a bunch of tier ones at the same time. If you have accounts worth 500,000 ARR and accounts worth 3,000 ARR, extreme example, but this is going to happen sometimes, you're not going to have the same person manage both. And the mixed tiering isn't like here's all of your customers, here's how you tier, boom. This is going to vary again, company by company, product by product. Like in this case, where your customers vary between 500K and 3,000, you probably don't have that many high touch actual CSM relationships at the bottom end of the spectrum. You can have, like I talked about, Dan Reese, who invented customer success at Paperturn. You can have experiences like that where you have a no touch tier, where there is a minimum spend, a minimum size where you have customer support at all. There are upsides and downsides of that, but if you do it well, totally makes sense. And that way you are not wasting CSM hours and support on those low dollar accounts. Low dollar accounts. First, because they're going to ignore the 3K account, and rightfully so. If I'm their manager, I expect them to spend 110% of their time on the 500K account. We'll get to that. Second, because the level of experience and skill needed to manage the 500K account is much higher, and therefore compensation for that CSM should be a lot higher as well. If I'm building that team, I'm not going to pay senior level salaries to give 3K accounts. And yeah, that again is an extreme case. Like the balance of compensation versus value of the tier or value of the portfolio, excuse me, versus overall value of the team. Like there's a lot to unpack here. This right here is talking about that hierarchy I talked about where having a tier one versus a tier three all assumes that the people in those tiers have different skill levels and values the tier one higher than the tier three, which I don't think is the right approach. I think they have a lot to benefit from each other, and there's a lot more balance in the pay scale that you could do. So your entry level people start at a higher entry level. Your top tier people still end up top compensation level. But that again is it's just a way to look at this and what works for your team, your company, your product, their portfolios. Like this idea that absolutely like this is wrong. And this, of course, extreme example where it's just 3,000 or just 500,000 without discussing any of the nuance and contract value between them is not taking the time to fully explore the conversation. I am going to be a little bit dismissive of Dojebot's comment here because I just don't think this is true. And in my experience, again, some of the absolute strongest CSMs out there are the ones managing your tier three and tier four. They are good and they understand the use cases in the product, arguably better than your tier ones do in many cases. They're challenged in different ways, and mixed tiering makes sure that everyone has that kind of broad base of experience. That's a whole different conversation about where your line is between tiers. Where would you start a zero touch tier? What level gets CS support at all? This also is going to vary by product, of course. There are many cases where the product scales by customer size, but the product itself is very similar. Sometimes a 500K count is just a difference in number of sites serviced or volume of work done, outgoing messages, for example. And again, there's the increased risk of putting so much of your total ARR in the hands of your smallest team of CSMs, which no one is addressing. Not a single commenter person has addressed the challenge of having your tier one be your smallest and highest pressured people. Not a single person has mentioned that being one of the key challenges here that we're talking about. They've all talked about how everyone wants to be a tier one CSM because they make the most money, which is, of course, only part of the conversation. And then right here sounds right for small businesses, but for large businesses, you'll have many people handling tier one accounts. So that if the person in charge of that some many people handling tier one, so if the person in charge of some of them leaves, then you'll just have someone else who also has experience at tier one to pick those up. Some businesses are too big to let everyone loose on every account. Better to let people have their own lane and focus on that set of customers in large orgs. Also, yes, I agree, having an account up or downgraded, therefore move between people can be counterintuitive. And you could always do something like if you move contract tiers, you still stay with the same customer success manager regardless. Like that's always an option. Uh, and just something we could talk about. So, yeah, that's kind of where we are in the conversation here. And I wrote a whole article about on this, but just to kind of recap and highlight where we started at and where we're talking about here. So the current practice is to have tier one, which has a significant amount of your total annual revenue in the hands of the smallest level CSMs who have the toughest work, the highest expectation of travel, who are theoretically your very top performers, but who you ask the most of. These are the people who are compensated the best, but who don't get breaks or weekends, who don't get vacations. Like these are people who are work extremely, extremely hard because they exclusively support your top dollar customers. That's a recipe to gamble most of your company's annual revenue on the hardest possible ask. Hard to recruit, hard to shuffle, hard to cover for, hard to balance out what they're doing. Opposite end of the spectrum, you end up undervaluing your tier threes and your lowest tier customer CSMs. And you lose a lot of customer sentiment, revenue growth, actionable insights. You lose a lot by having your tier three be undervalued by having this extreme separation between the two. Tier two ends up being one of the most successful tiers because it has growth potential plus good ARR, plus tends to be fairly sizable, doesn't have the volume of work that they're drowning in like tier three, doesn't have the level of touch that they're drowning in like tier one. Now, this is your standard approach again. And of course, you can move the line of who actually gets CSM support and who doesn't. You could cut out tier three entirely and have tier two and tier one just being that like minimum contract size actually gets you customer support or customer success support. And that's a way to do it. Like there are a lot of ways to do this, but I would argue there are so many potential vulnerabilities of your aggressive tier system, especially that tier one. That tier one is a huge, huge risk, and then you're actually losing some of the growth and retention, shared knowledge and collaboration that you get at the lower tiers by doing it this way. This is a much more standard approach for different team types. Like you have a senior level person that's like assumed to do this thing. But if you're talking customer success as an industry, I personally think it makes way, way more sense to do some form of mixed tiering. And you've already got that Deuterian example where it's talking about having lead CSM plus assisting CSMs plus your supporting teams or your like integration and like your technical teams. There's some really good approaches out there to do this, but I have not seen anyone in any of these comments successfully defend the workload and work strategy of tier one tiering in particular, and not a one of them reference tier three, except saying that people in that space benefit the most from staying in their lane, and leaders in those spaces benefit from the most from having experience with that specific tier. And there is something to be said about that. But it also is a huge gap in your team if anybody in any leadership position, if any senior CSM doesn't understand the work that the other CSMs are doing. Uniquely so, because customer success is such a collaborative thing, such a kind of live moving target process where it benefits the most from having equally balanced like leadership and experience throughout it. And it's also a single department. So if you have your like director of customer success making decisions based only on their experience in tier one or tier three and not based on the experience of all three tiers with a full intimate understanding of every single size of customer, that's a problem. That's going to lead to some very strange decision making processes. It's going to lead to some really weird stuff going on. And I personally think that's going to lead to a lot of challenges. So I happy to have the conversation, happy to talk about this more. Hopefully this is something that kind of makes sense and is something that can work for, is something that we could continue the conversation about. I want to challenge the status quo and also have a conversation that a lot of companies are looking at their customer success teams and saying, why isn't this process working? What's going on? Where is our point of failure? And I hope we've touched on a lot of the potential places, both where there could be points of failure and where we could see dramatic improvement in the process. And that's it. There we go. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback here. Cheers.